You can sit near the kitchen, Naomi. It's probably more comfortable for you there. The sentence landed softly across the dining room, but somehow it still silenced the sound of silverware against porcelain. Naomi Carter stood near the long mahogany table with her coat still folded over one arm, while warm Thanksgiving lights spilled from the crystal chandelier above her head. The house smelled like rosemary turkey, brown butter, and cinnamon, the kind of expensive holiday warmth that looked perfect in photographs and felt cold in real life. Daniel Brooks didn't even look embarrassed after saying it. If anything, the corner of his mouth twitched like he was proud of himself. Around him, his family pretended not to react. His mother adjusted her pearl bracelet. His younger brother stared into his bourbon glass. And Emily Dawson, the woman sitting in Naomi's old seat, lowered her eyes just enough to hide a smile. Naomi noticed the ring first, not because it was large, but because she remembered the exact jewelry store where it came from. 5 years ago, she had stood beside Daniel under fluorescent lights while he apologized for not being able to afford the diamond she deserved. She had kissed his cheek and told him love mattered more than money. Tonight, that same ring rested on another woman's hand while soft jazz played through hidden speakers in the ceiling. The kitchen table is right through there, Margaret Brooks added gently, as if humiliation sounded kinder in a quieter voice. Naomi finally nodded once. Of course. She walked past the dining room without rushing, her heels clicking softly against polished hardwood floors. The kitchen was bright and overheated from cooking all day. Steam curled from silver pots near the stove while 2 catering assistants whispered to each other beside trays of sweet potatoes and cranberry sauce. At the far corner sat a small round table with 3 folding chairs. One of them had already been pulled out for her. Naomi placed her purse down carefully and removed her gloves finger by finger. Through the open doorway, she could still hear Daniel laughing loudly for his guests, performing success the way some men perform kindness when cameras are around. 3 years ago, Naomi had helped him build everything inside that house. She used to package orders on the living room floor while Daniel slept upstairs. She skipped vacations, postponed graduate school, and worked double shifts so his company could survive its first winter. Back then, Daniel used to call her his backbone. Tonight, he introduced her as someone who used to be part of the family. Emily suddenly appeared near the kitchen entrance, holding a wine glass delicately between manicured fingers. Her white dress shimmered softly beneath the lights. "I hope this isn't awkward for you," she said. Naomi looked up calmly. "Why would it be?" Emily glanced toward the dining room. "Well, seeing everyone move on." Naomi folded her napkin slowly across her lap. "People move on every day." For a second, Emily's smile weakened. Somewhere deeper inside the house, laughter exploded again after something Daniel said. Naomi recognized his voice immediately, confident and loud. The same voice that once promised her forever inside a tiny apartment with broken heat and unpaid bills stacked beside the microwave. Then came the sound of a champagne glass tapping gently for attention. Daniel was making a toast. Naomi could hear every word from where she sat near the kitchen. "I'm thankful for growth," he announced proudly. "Sometimes people leave your life so better people can enter it." A few uncomfortable laughs followed. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the untouched plate in front of her. Her face revealed nothing. But outside, beyond the frosted dining room windows, headlights slowly swept across the driveway as a long black Rolls-Royce pulled silently to the curb. The sound of the front door opening traveled through the house like a change in weather. Conversations slowed first. Then forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the jazz music floating softly from the ceiling speakers suddenly felt too quiet. Naomi remained seated at the small kitchen table, her hands resting calmly beside an untouched glass of water while one of the catering assistants peeked nervously toward the foyer. Outside, snow had started falling over the Brooks estate in slow white streaks, dusting the stone driveway and the dark roof of the Rolls-Royce parked beneath the front lanterns. Margaret Brooks rose from her chair in the dining room before anyone else did. "That must be the investor Daniel mentioned," she said, smoothing the front of her emerald silk blouse. Daniel quickly adjusted his jacket and checked his reflection in the nearby window. The confidence returned to his face instantly. Naomi noticed how fast he transformed whenever money entered the room. "Everyone," Daniel announced proudly, lifting his wine glass again. "This could be a very important partnership for Brooks Capital next year." Emily leaned closer to him with a polished smile. You never told me your investor was arriving tonight. Daniel kissed the side of her cheek lightly. I wanted it to be a surprise. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from a bowl of sweet potatoes beside her. 3 years ago, Daniel used to look at her exactly the same way whenever she stayed awake, helping him rewrite presentations at 2 in the morning. Back then, they lived in a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat in Southside Chicago. The heat barely worked during winter, and every time the upstairs neighbors walked across the floor, dust drifted from the ceiling fan onto their kitchen counter. But Daniel used to hold Naomi's hand like she was the only good thing in his difficult life. She remembered sitting beside him on the floor surrounded by overdue bills while eating takeout from paper containers because they could not afford plates after moving in. Daniel once promised her that if he ever became successful, he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never felt invisible again. The memory faded the moment Emily's laughter echoed through the dining room. Naomi looked up just enough to see Emily twisting the old engagement ring beneath the chandelier light. I still cannot believe this house, Emily whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Daniel says he practically built everything from nothing. Naomi said nothing. One of the catering assistants quietly placed a slice of pecan pie near her elbow before hurrying away. Through the doorway, Naomi watched Daniel walk confidently toward the foyer while adjusting his cufflinks. The entire family straightened in their seats, eager smiles appearing almost instantly. Money changed posture faster than pride ever could. Then came the sound of slow footsteps against marble floors. Calm, unhurried, heavy enough to command attention without trying. Daniel's voice suddenly shifted into something softer, almost nervous. Mr. Hale, he said carefully. Welcome. We are honored to have you here tonight. Naomi closed her eyes briefly at the sound of the name. Sebastian Hale. Around the dining room table, reactions spread one by one. Margaret's hand flew to her chest. Daniel's younger brother nearly dropped his bourbon glass. Emily whispered, Wait, the Sebastian Hale? Naomi remained perfectly still. She could already picture him standing near the entrance in a charcoal wool coat dusted with snow, one hand resting casually in his pocket, his quiet blue eyes scanning the room without urgency. Sebastian never walked into spaces trying to impress people. That was why people noticed him immediately. Daniel laughed nervously from the foyer. Please, come meet everyone. But instead of answering, the footsteps continued deeper into the house. Past the chandelier, past the dining room, past the people who suddenly looked desperate to matter. Naomi heard the kitchen doorway open behind her. Then, after a brief silence warm enough to stop her breathing for half a second, came the familiar low voice she had not heard in weeks. There you are. Naomi did not turn around immediately. She recognized Sebastian Hale's voice the way people recognize a song that once carried them through a difficult season of life. Calm, steady, warm without demanding attention. Around her, the kitchen seemed to freeze in place. One of the catering assistants stopped stacking plates. The dishwasher hummed softly beneath the silence while snow continued falling outside the windows in slow white waves. Naomi finally looked over her shoulder. Sebastian stood in the doorway wearing a charcoal overcoat over a black suit that fit him with quiet precision. Snowflakes melted slowly against the dark wool across his shoulders. He carried no arrogance with him, no performance, no need to prove his importance to anyone in the room. Yet somehow every eye in the house had already found him. Sebastian's blue eyes settled gently on Naomi first, not the dining room, not Daniel, not the people suddenly desperate for his approval. Just Naomi. Traffic leaving downtown was worse than I expected, he said softly. I hope I did not keep you waiting too long. Naomi rose slowly from the small kitchen chair. You made it. A faint smile touched Sebastian's face at the sound of her voice. Then, without hesitation, he stepped closer and took her coat from the back of the chair like it was the most natural thing in the world. The movement was simple, almost quiet, but the effect traveled through the house instantly. Daniel appeared at the kitchen entrance seconds later with Emily close behind him. The confidence that once filled his posture had changed shape entirely. Now it looked strained, stretched too tightly beneath forced politeness. Mr. Hale, Daniel said quickly, extending his hand again. We are honored you could join us tonight. Sebastian glanced at the offered hand politely before shaking it once. Brief. Professional. Nothing more. Thank you for inviting me. Daniel laughed softly, trying to regain control of the room. Please, come sit with us in the dining room. We were just about to start dessert. Sebastian looked toward the small folding table beside the kitchen wall, then back toward the long dining table glowing beneath chandelier light in the other room. His gaze lingered briefly on the empty place settings and polished wine glasses before returning calmly to Naomi. I think I will stay wherever Naomi is sitting. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Emily's smile faltered almost instantly. Margaret Brooks lowered her eyes toward the floor while Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. Naomi said nothing. She simply watched Sebastian remove his gloves carefully, one finger at a time, before placing them beside her purse on the small table like none of this embarrassed him at all. That was the part Daniel could not understand. Men like him believed status had to be displayed loudly. Expensive watches, loud laughter, long dining tables. But Sebastian carried power the way oceans carry depth. Quietly, naturally. Daniel forced another smile. Actually, Naomi chose to sit in here. Sebastian's expression never changed. Did she? The question was calm, but something inside it made the entire room uncomfortable. Emily crossed her arms lightly. It was just easier with seating arrangements. Sebastian nodded once as if accepting the explanation, though his eyes said otherwise. Then he pulled out Naomi's chair himself before taking the seat beside her at the small kitchen table. The billionaire investor Daniel had spent 6 months chasing sat beside the woman Daniel had tried to humiliate near the stove and catering trays. Silence spread through the dining room doorway like smoke. Naomi noticed Daniel's jaw tighten slightly. She remembered that look. It used to appear whenever investors rejected his pitches during the early years of his company. Back then, Naomi would squeeze his hand beneath restaurant tables and whisper that one bad night did not define a man's future. Tonight, no one reached for Daniel's hand. Sebastian glanced toward Naomi's untouched slice of pecan pie. You still do that, he said quietly. Do what? Let your coffee get cold when something is bothering you. Naomi looked down at the untouched mug beside her plate. A small breath escaped her before the corners of her mouth finally lifted into the first real smile she had shown all evening. And across the room, Daniel Brooks saw it. Daniel stared at Naomi's smile the way people stare at old photographs after realizing they threw away something irreplaceable. It was not a dramatic smile, not victorious, not mocking, just real. And somehow that unsettled him more than anger ever could. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for everyone standing there. Margaret Brooks quickly stepped forward, forcing warmth into her voice. Mr. Hale, please, you should join us at the main table. Sebastian looked toward the dining room where candles flickered beside crystal glasses and polished silverware. Then he glanced back at Naomi sitting quietly beside the steam of untouched coffee. I am comfortable here, he replied. Daniel laughed softly, though tension tightened beneath it. You do not have to sit in the kitchen. Naomi finally reached for her fork. It is fine, Daniel. The way she said his name stopped him for half a second. No bitterness. No softness either. Just distance. The kind that forms after disappointment hardens into clarity. Emily shifted uneasily near the doorway. I think everyone is making this more serious than it is. Sebastian folded his napkin carefully onto his lap before looking up at her politely. Sometimes small decisions tell you everything about a room. Silence followed immediately. Somewhere in the living room, the jazz playlist quietly changed songs. Snow continued falling outside the windows, covering the driveway in white, while the warmth inside the house somehow felt colder than before. Daniel loosened his tie slightly. Mr. Hale, I wanted tonight to be informal. I appreciate you considering the merger proposal. Naomi lowered her eyes toward her plate again. Merger proposal. She knew exactly how much that meeting mattered. 6 months earlier, Brooks Capital lost nearly $12 million after a failed commercial real estate expansion in Phoenix. Daniel had hidden it publicly, but investors in Chicago were already whispering. Sebastian rested one hand beside his water glass. I reviewed the numbers. Daniel immediately straightened, and Sebastian's expression remained calm. I prefer discussing business after dessert. Emily forced a smile toward Naomi. So how did you two meet? Naomi dabbed her napkin gently against the corner of her mouth before answering. At the Fairmont downtown. Sebastian glanced at her with quiet amusement. You left out the important part. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. What important part? Sebastian leaned back in the folding chair as though sitting beside catering trays had never bothered him for a second. She thought I was the hotel manager. A faint laugh escaped Margaret despite herself. Naomi shook her head lightly. You were carrying your own luggage. Because my assistant abandoned me at the airport. You still looked annoyed. I was annoyed. The exchange was effortless. Warm. Familiar in a way that expensive rings and staged smiles could never imitate. Daniel noticed it too. Naomi used to laugh with him like that once. Before money became the center of every conversation. Before success taught him to measure people by usefulness instead of loyalty. Emily crossed one leg over the other carefully. Well, I suppose billionaire hotel guests are not exactly common. Sebastian's eyes shifted toward her politely. Neither are women who rebuild themselves without becoming bitter. The room fell quiet again. Naomi looked down slowly, almost uncomfortable with the attention. Daniel reached for his wine glass too quickly and nearly knocked it against his plate. The sharp sound echoed across the kitchen tile. Naomi always worked hard, he muttered. She supported me for years. Sebastian nodded once. I know. Daniel blinked. You know? Sebastian folded his hands calmly. The first time Naomi and I had dinner together, she spent 2 hours talking about your early company struggles. The warehouse lease. The unpaid payroll during year 2. The investors who stopped answering your calls. Daniel stared at him silently now. She defended you. Sebastian continued quietly. Even after the divorce. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her napkin. Daniel looked at her for the first time all evening without arrogance attached to his expression. Only confusion. Perhaps even shame. And for the first time since Naomi arrived at the house, nobody seemed interested in the size of the dining table anymore. Because somehow, at a small folding table near the kitchen, the balance of power inside the entire room had already changed. The air inside the kitchen changed after that. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone felt it. The folding table near the stove no longer looked like punishment. Somehow, it had become the center of the entire evening. Daniel noticed it first in the way people kept glancing toward Sebastian instead of the dining room chandelier he spent nearly $30,000 importing from Italy. Even his own brother, Tyler, had quietly abandoned the main table and drifted closer to the kitchen doorway pretending to refill his drink. Margaret Brooks kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from her blouse while searching for ways to recover control of the night. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, Daniel mentioned your firm is expanding into international markets next year. Sebastian accepted the coffee. Naomi finally slid toward him. Possibly. Margaret smiled too quickly. Daniel has incredible instincts with growth strategy. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the steam rising from her own cup. Once upon a time, Daniel used to ask for her opinion before every major business decision. Back when his office was a borrowed desk inside a shared workspace downtown, he called Naomi during lunch breaks just to hear her thoughts on client proposals. She used to sit cross-legged on their apartment floor with spreadsheets spread around her while snow piled outside the windows. Some nights they survived on instant noodles and grocery store coffee because every spare dollar went back into his company. Daniel once told her, "When we make it, this struggle will be our favorite memory." But success changed the meaning of the word we. Naomi always had good instincts too. Tyler muttered suddenly from the doorway. Daniel shot him a sharp look immediately. Tyler shrugged awkwardly into his whiskey glass. I mean, she practically helped build Brooks Capital. Emily's smile tightened. Support is important in relationships. Sebastian glanced toward her calmly. Support and sacrifice are not always the same thing. Silence settled again. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Naomi never cared much about the business side. Naomi finally looked at him directly for the first time in nearly an hour. Her face stayed calm, but something behind her eyes hardened quietly. I handled your first 3 investor presentations, she said softly. Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. Sebastian took a slow sip of coffee without interrupting her. Naomi continued gently. I also rewrote the Phoenix expansion pitch after your original numbers failed compliance review. Tyler blinked. Wait, that was you. Daniel's jaw tightened. That was years ago. Naomi nodded once. Yes, it was. Sebastian rested his cup beside hers. The revised proposal became one of the highest performing presentations in private equity forums that year. Daniel stared at him now. How do you know that? Sebastian's expression remained unreadable. Because my firm reviewed it before deciding not to invest. The sentence landed heavily across the kitchen. Even Emily stopped moving. Daniel swallowed once before forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. Well, I suppose things worked out eventually. Sebastian did not smile. Not exactly. Snow pressed softly against the windows now, covering the dark driveway almost completely. The warmth from the oven wrapped around the kitchen while the rest of the house suddenly felt distant and decorative, like a showroom nobody truly lived in. Margaret cleared her throat nervously. Dessert is getting cold. But nobody moved toward the dining room. Naomi noticed Daniel watching her differently now. Not with affection. Not even regret yet. More like someone trying desperately to recalculate a story he had told himself for years. Emily stepped closer to Daniel's side and slipped her hand through his arm possessively. The diamond ring caught chandelier light again. Naomi looked at it only briefly this time. It no longer hurt the way it once did. That surprised her most of all. Sebastian noticed the direction of her eyes. Quietly, without drawing attention to it, he reached beside her plate and adjusted the sleeve of her black dress where it had folded beneath her wrist. The gesture lasted barely a second. Soft, natural, intimate in the gentlest possible way. But Daniel saw it immediately. He remembered the years Naomi used to reach across restaurant tables to straighten his tie before investor meetings because his hands shook when he was nervous. He remembered how she once waited 4 hours in a hospital lobby after his panic attack during year 3 of the company because he was too ashamed to let anyone else see him struggling. And standing there beside a woman who admired his success but never knew his failures, Daniel suddenly realized something unbearable. Sebastian Hale did not inherit the strongest version of Naomi Carter. He was simply the man who arrived after everyone else failed to appreciate her. By the time the clock above the stove reached 9:15, nobody cared about dessert anymore. The untouched pecan pie sat cooling beside melting whipped cream while conversations drifted awkwardly around the kitchen in fragile circles. Daniel kept trying to pull attention back toward business, but every attempt seemed to dissolve the moment Sebastian looked at Naomi again. It was subtle, the way he listened when she spoke, the way his expression softened whenever she smiled quietly at something small. Daniel noticed all of it because once upon a time, he had been the man sitting beside her instead. Margaret finally forced herself to stand. "We should move this gathering back into the dining room," she announced with artificial brightness. "People are cramped in here." Tyler nodded quickly. "Yeah, we can clear more space." But Sebastian remained seated comfortably at the folding table while Naomi traced one fingertip slowly along the rim of her coffee cup. "Actually," Sebastian said calmly, "I enjoy this room." Emily folded her arms tighter across her white dress. "It is a kitchen." Sebastian glanced around at the warm lights reflecting against copper pots and holiday dishes stacked near the sink. "Exactly." Naomi lowered her eyes to hide the faint smile, threatening her composure again. Daniel leaned against the counter with visible frustration, now pressing beneath his polished image. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully, "I hope tonight has not given you the wrong impression." Sebastian looked at him evenly. What impression would that be? Daniel hesitated. "That we are disrespectful." Silence settled heavily across the room. Naomi could hear snow tapping softly against the windows now. The storm outside had thickened, covering the driveway and front lawn in white. Somewhere upstairs, old pipes groaned softly through the walls. The house suddenly sounded older than it looked. Sebastian rested his elbows lightly against the table. "Do you want an honest answer?" Daniel forced a small laugh. "Of course." Sebastian nodded once toward Naomi. "You invited a woman who helped build your life, then seated her beside the kitchen because your new guests made you uncomfortable about your past." Nobody spoke. Emily looked down first. Tyler stared into his glass again. Even Margaret seemed unable to defend her son anymore. Daniel's face hardened slightly. "That is not what happened." Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward him. Calm. Steady. "Then what happened?" The question was gentle, but it carried years inside it. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, because the truth sat too visibly in the room now. In the expensive chandelier. In the empty seat Emily occupied. In the folding chair Naomi had been expected to accept quietly. Sebastian reached for Naomi's hand beneath the table. The movement was small enough that almost nobody noticed except Daniel. And somehow that made it worse. Not possessive. Not dramatic. Just certain. Daniel remembered another Thanksgiving nearly 8 years earlier when Naomi burned the turkey accidentally inside their tiny apartment oven. They ended up eating pancakes at midnight while sitting on the floor wrapped in blankets because neither of them could afford proper furniture yet. Naomi laughed so hard syrup nearly spilled onto the carpet. Back then, Daniel used to think surviving hard times together meant love would last forever automatically. He never realized love also required gratitude. Emily suddenly spoke into the silence. I did not know Naomi was involved in the company like that. Naomi looked toward her politely. Most people did not. Daniel rubbed one hand across his jaw tiredly. Naomi never wanted attention. Sebastian's eyes shifted toward him. No, she just deserved respect. The words landed with enough force to quiet the entire room again. Margaret slowly sat down near the kitchen island as though exhaustion had finally reached her shoulders. We made mistakes, she admitted softly. Daniel looked at his mother in disbelief. Mom. But Margaret only stared at Naomi now. You used to bring me soup when my arthritis flared up during winter. Naomi blinked once, surprised by the memory. Margaret swallowed carefully, even after working 12-hour shifts. The kitchen grew still again except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant wind outside. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor for the first time all evening. Naomi watched him quietly, searching for anger inside herself and finding almost none left. That was the strange part about healing. One day, the people who broke you stop feeling powerful at all. Sebastian squeezed her hand gently beneath the table, as if sensing the exact moment she realized it too. The storm outside deepened as the night stretched on. Snow buried the edges of the Brooks estate in thick white layers, while icy wind pressed softly against the windows. Inside the kitchen, warmth lingered in the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and cooling turkey, but nobody seemed comfortable anymore. Daniel stood near the counter with both hands braced against the marble surface as though steadying himself against something invisible. Across from him, Sebastian remained calm beside Naomi, completely untouched by the tension spreading through the house. Tyler quietly slipped away to refill drinks nobody was really drinking anymore. Emily sat near the dining room entrance, twisting the diamond ring around her finger repeatedly, the sparkle no longer carrying the confidence it had earlier that evening. Naomi noticed all of it without reacting. That was the difference now. Years ago, she would have felt responsible for fixing the discomfort in the room. She would have smiled too quickly, softened conversations, protected Daniel from embarrassment. Tonight, she simply existed peacefully inside her own silence. Margaret folded her hands together near the kitchen island. Naomi, she said softly, I never thanked you properly for everything you did for this family. Daniel closed his eyes briefly at the sentence. Naomi looked toward Margaret carefully. The older woman suddenly seemed smaller than she had once appeared. Age and regret had a way of lowering people quietly over time. You do not owe me anything, Naomi answered. Margaret shook her head slowly. That is not true. Sebastian glanced toward Naomi but remained silent, allowing the moment to belong entirely to her. Daniel finally straightened away from the counter. Can we stop making this sound tragic? He muttered. The marriage ended years ago. Naomi looked at him calmly. Yes, it did. Daniel laughed once without humor. You act like I destroyed your life. Sebastian's expression sharpened slightly, though his voice remained even. Did she say that? Daniel looked toward him immediately. You do not know everything that happened between us. Sebastian nodded once. No, I only know the version where she rebuilt herself without trying to destroy you afterward. Silence settled heavily again. Emily finally stood from her chair. I think everybody is overreacting tonight. Her voice sounded thinner than before. People divorce all the time. Naomi studied her for a moment. Not cruelly, just honestly. Emily was younger, beautiful, eager to belong inside rooms filled with expensive wine and polished reputations. Naomi remembered being young enough to confuse ambition with character too. You are right, Naomi said gently. People do divorce all the time. Emily relaxed slightly. Then Naomi added quietly, but not everyone forgets who carried them before success arrived. The words landed softly, but Daniel flinched like he had been caught off guard by something unavoidable. Outside, headlights suddenly swept across the front windows again as another car slowly approached the driveway. Tyler peeked toward the living room. More guests. Daniel frowned. At this hour? Seconds later, The front doorbell echoed faintly through the house. One of the household staff hurried to answer it. Sebastian glanced briefly toward his watch before looking at Naomi again. That should be Claire. Daniel blinked. Claire. Sebastian nodded. My attorney. The kitchen went completely still. Emily looked confused first. Margaret stared openly now. Tyler nearly spilled his drink again. Daniel forced out a strained laugh. Attorney sounds serious for Thanksgiving dinner. Sebastian folded his gloves carefully beside his coffee cup. Usually, yes. Naomi remained composed, though she knew exactly why Claire had arrived. Earlier that week, Sebastian offered Brooks Capital a final review opportunity before formally declining the merger proposal. Naomi had advised him not to embarrass Daniel publicly. At the time, she still believed protecting old wounds mattered. But tonight changed something. Not because Daniel hurt her again, because he revealed he still did not understand what he had lost. Footsteps approached through the foyer. A tall blonde woman entered the kitchen holding a leather portfolio beneath her coat. Sorry for the delay, Claire said while brushing snowflakes from her sleeve. Then she noticed Daniel standing beside the counter. Mr. Brooks. Daniel looked between her and Sebastian carefully now. What exactly is this? Sebastian leaned back slightly in his chair, calm as winter outside the windows. A business decision. Daniel swallowed once. About the merger? Sebastian's eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi before returning to him. About whether I invest in people who only value loyalty after they realize its price. No one moved after Sebastian spoke. The words remained suspended in the kitchen like the final note of a song nobody wanted to interrupt. Outside, wind dragged snow across the dark windows in soft white streaks, while the grandfather clock somewhere in the hallway marked each passing second with slow authority. Claire removed her coat carefully beside the doorway and placed the leather portfolio against the counter. She understood tension professionally. Years around billion-dollar negotiations had taught her how silence could shift power faster than shouting ever could. Daniel tried to recover first. I think we are mixing personal history with business, he said tightly. Sebastian remained seated beside Naomi, one hand resting calmly near hers on the table. Human character is business, he replied, especially in leadership. Daniel gave a strained smile toward Claire. I hope this is not how your firm usually handles Thanksgiving. Claire met his eyes evenly. Mr. Hale originally declined tonight's invitation. Daniel blinked once. Then why did he come? Claire glanced briefly toward Naomi before answering. Because Mrs. Hale asked him to. The room went still. Completely still. Emily's hand froze around the stem of her wine glass. Tyler slowly lowered his drink. Margaret stared openly now, confusion and realization colliding across her face at the same time. Daniel looked directly at Naomi as though he had stopped hearing properly. Mrs. Hale, he repeated quietly. Naomi did not rush to explain. She simply reached for the coffee cup beside her plate, while snowlight reflected softly across the black fabric of her dress. Sebastian looked at Daniel calmly. We got married in September. The silence afterward felt enormous. Emily's face lost color first. Margaret's lips parted slightly. Tyler whispered a stunned curse beneath his breath before catching himself. But Daniel said nothing at all. Naomi remembered the exact afternoon Sebastian proposed. There were no photographers. No expensive restaurant reserved months in advance. Just autumn rain tapping against the windows of her downtown office, while unfinished client reports sat scattered across her desk. Sebastian handed her a small velvet box and said, I spent most of my life around people who admired success. You are the first person who ever made peace feel valuable. She cried quietly for nearly 10 minutes before answering him. Not because of the ring. Because after years of surviving disappointment, gentleness still surprised her. Daniel finally laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor inside it. You married him? Naomi looked toward him steadily. Yes. Daniel stared at Sebastian now, trying to reconcile the billionaire investor sitting calmly at the folding table with the woman he once believed would always remain emotionally attached to him somehow. Why did nobody know? Emily asked softly. Naomi answered before Sebastian could. Because not everything meaningful needs an audience. The sentence landed hardest on Daniel. For years, his entire life had become performance. Bigger houses, louder parties, more expensive watches. But the happiest moment of Naomi's new life happened quietly without needing anybody's approval at all. Claire finally opened the leather portfolio. Mr. Brooks, regarding the merger proposal. Daniel straightened automatically despite the storm moving through his expression now. Yes. Claire slid a single document across the counter toward him. Hale Ventures will not proceed with acquisition discussions. Daniel stared down at the paper without touching it. You are rejecting the deal? Sebastian's voice remained calm. I am declining involvement with leadership I do not trust. Daniel looked up sharply. This is personal. No. Sebastian answered evenly. This is pattern recognition. The kitchen fell silent again except for distant wind outside. Naomi watched Daniel carefully now. Not with triumph. Not with revenge. Just clarity. For the first time all evening, he looked exactly like the young man from their old apartment years ago. Tired. Uncertain. Afraid of losing everything he worked for. The difference was simple now. Back then, Naomi stood beside him. Tonight, she did not. Emily slowly removed her hand from Daniel's arm. Margaret lowered her eyes toward the floor, while Tyler quietly walked away into the dining room, unable to watch anymore. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. Naomi. She looked at him calmly. His voice softened in a way nobody had heard all evening. Were you ever going to tell me? Naomi glanced briefly toward Sebastian beside her. Then she looked back at the man who once mistook her loyalty for permanence. You stopped asking about my life a long time ago. The house grew quieter after that. Not the comfortable quiet of family gatherings winding down after a long holiday meal, but the heavy kind that settles over people when truth finally arrives uninvited. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, covering the driveway, the hedges, the stone walkway leading toward the front gate. Inside the kitchen, warm light reflected against untouched dishes and half-empty wine glasses while nobody seemed certain what to say next. Daniel stood motionless beside the marble counter with Claire's rejection letter still resting unopened near his hand. Emily had moved farther away now, lingering near the dining room entrance like someone slowly realizing she had entered the wrong story entirely. Margaret remained seated quietly at the kitchen island, her eyes fixed on Naomi with the exhaustion of a woman replaying years inside her own memory. Sebastian rose first. Smoothly, calmly. He reached for Naomi's coat from the back of her chair and held it open for her without speaking. Naomi slipped her arms into the black wool slowly while the room watched in silence. The gesture was simple, but it carried something Daniel suddenly understood too late. Care. Real care. The kind that reveals itself in ordinary moments rather than public performances. Naomi adjusted the sleeve near her wrist before looking toward Margaret. Thank you for dinner. Margaret's eyes filled slightly, though she smiled through it. You always thank people, she whispered softly. Naomi said nothing to that. Some truths no longer needed discussion. Daniel finally stepped forward. Naomi. His voice sounded unfamiliar now. Smaller somehow. Naomi turned toward him patiently. For a second, he looked exactly like the man she once loved inside that tiny apartment years ago. No expensive watch. No polished confidence. Just a tired man standing in the ruins of his own pride. I did love you, he said quietly. Sebastian remained still beside her, giving the moment room to exist without interruption. Naomi studied Daniel carefully, and for the first time all evening, there was no hurt left inside her expression. Only distance softened by understanding. I know, she answered gently. Daniel swallowed hard. Then where did everything go wrong? Snow brushed softly against the windows behind them. Naomi remembered long nights balancing unpaid bills beside cheap takeout containers. She remembered ironing Daniel's shirts before investor meetings because he was too anxious to focus. She remembered believing loyalty meant staying through every version of someone. But she also remembered the day he stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as part of the background. Success changed what you valued, she said softly. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately because deep down, he already knew she was right. Tyler appeared quietly near the hallway holding everyone's coats awkwardly in his arms. Storm is getting worse, he muttered. Sebastian thanked him politely before taking Naomi's gloves from the table. Daniel watched every movement carefully now, as though witnessing a language he never learned to speak fluently himself. Emily finally slipped the engagement ring from her finger slowly and placed it beside her untouched wine glass. Nobody reacted out loud, but the sound of the diamond touching crystal echoed softly through the kitchen. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Naomi noticed it without satisfaction. Revenge had once sounded powerful in her imagination during lonely nights after the divorce. She used to imagine dramatic confrontations, apologies, regret. But standing here now beneath warm kitchen lights while snow buried the world outside, she realized healing felt much quieter than revenge ever could. Sebastian rested one hand gently against the small of her back. "Ready?" he asked softly. Naomi looked at him and nodded once. Together, they walked toward the foyer while the house remained silent behind them. Daniel did not follow immediately. He only stood there beside the folding table near the kitchen, staring at the empty chair Naomi once occupied earlier that evening. The same chair they expected her to accept without dignity. The same chair where everything in the room eventually changed. Outside, cold winter air wrapped around Naomi as Sebastian opened the passenger door of the Rolls-Royce for her. Snowflakes landed softly against her hair before melting instantly beneath the warmth of the car lights. Just before getting inside, Naomi glanced back once toward the glowing windows of the house behind her. Years ago, she would have given anything to remain wanted inside that family. Tonight, she felt nothing except peace. Sebastian settled into the driver's seat beside her while the engine hummed quietly beneath them. The house slowly disappeared behind falling snow as they pulled away from the curb. And somewhere inside the silence of that long winter night, Daniel Brooks finally understood the one thing money never managed to teach him. She did not come back to win him again. She came back having already won herself.